Sometimes the hardest thing in life is knowing when someone special is sitting right in front of you. Most folks spend their whole lives searching for that one person who truly understands their heart. Jameson Burke had all the money a man could want, but Christmas dinner was turning into a disaster. He sat across from Eliza, a schoolteacher who'd lost her husband, and neither could find the right words. The silence stretched long and painful between them. Just when Jameson was ready to give up and call it a night, his old father leaned over and whispered something that changed everything. "She's the one, son. Don't be blind like I was." What could his father see that he couldn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Burke Ranch had been in the family for 4 generations, sprawling across 40,000 acres of Montana's finest grazing land. Willow Hall, the main house, stood proud against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, its windows glowing warm yellow in the December twilight. Inside, the dining room held the weight of tradition mahogany furniture that had weathered decades of family gatherings, crystal that caught the light from the massive stone fireplace, and portraits of Burke ancestors watching over their descendants with stern, weathered faces. Jameson Burke sat at the head of the table, a position that had been his for 3 years now since his mother's passing. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd never known want, yet his shoulders bore the invisible burden of expectations that stretched back to the first Burke who'd claimed this land. His hands, calloused from honest work despite his wealth, rested uneasily on the white tablecloth as he stole glances at the woman across from him. Miss Eliza Thorne possessed the kind of quiet beauty that grew more striking the longer you looked. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that framed her face without artifice, and her grey eyes held depths that spoke of both sorrow and strength. She wore a modest blue dress, her finest, though it was still simple by the standards of wealth that surrounded her. At 32, she'd been a widow for 3 years, long enough for the sharp edge of grief to soften into something more bearable, yet not so long that she'd forgotten what it meant to love completely. The Christmas feast spread before them was a testament to Martha's skill. Martha Hendricks, the housekeeper who'd raised Jameson after his mother took ill, and who now fretted over every detail of this carefully arranged evening. Roasted turkey, glazed to golden perfection, sweet potatoes candied with brown sugar and pecans, green beans still crisp and bright, and cornbread that steamed when broken open. The smell should have been welcoming, should have spoken of home and comfort, but instead it seemed to highlight the awkward space between 2 people who barely knew each other. The arrangement had been Judge Burke's idea, Jameson's father, now 67, and still sharp as the day he'd first donned his robes. Judge Thaddeus Burke had presided over the county court for 30 years, earning respect and not a little fear for his fairness and his ability to see through any manner of deception. He'd known Eliza's late husband, Daniel Thorne, a good man who died too young in a farming accident that had left his young wife to fend for herself. The judge had watched from afar as Eliza took over the one-room schoolhouse, teaching the children of ranchers and townspeople alike with a patience and intelligence that reminded him of his own late wife. "This is fine turkey, Miss Thorne," Jameson ventured, his voice carrying the slight roughness of a man more comfortable giving orders to ranch hands than making small talk with refined women. "Martha's been cooking for our family since I was knee-high to a grasshopper." Eliza looked up from her careful cutting of the meat, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's delicious, Mr. Burke. Please give her my compliments." Her voice held the cultured tones of someone who'd received an education, yet it carried an underlying warmth that spoke of genuine kindness rather than mere politeness. The silence that followed stretched like a chasm between them. Jameson found himself studying the way the firelight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, the graceful way her hands moved as she ate, the thoughtful expression that crossed her face when she looked toward the frost-covered windows. She was beautiful, certainly, But it was a different kind of beauty than he'd known in his few romantic encounters. This was beauty seasoned with experience, refined by hardship, deepened by loss. Judge Burke observed from his position at Jameson's right hand, his weathered face thoughtful as he watched his son fumble through the evening. The old man remembered his own courtship of Jameson's mother, how tongue-tied he'd become around the spirited young woman who'd eventually agreed to marry him. He saw in Eliza the same quiet strength that had attracted him to his beloved Sarah, the same intelligence that had made their marriage a partnership of minds as well as hearts. "I understand you've been teaching at the schoolhouse for nearly 3 years now," Judge Burke said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded courtrooms, but tempered with grandfatherly warmth. "The children speak highly of you. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that her youngest, Tommy, has taken quite a shine to his lessons since you arrived." Eliza's smile became more genuine at the mention of her students. "Tommy's a bright boy. He reminds me quite a bit of my Daniel at that age, always asking questions about everything under the sun." She paused, a shadow crossing her features at the mention of her late husband, but she continued with evident fondness. "Children have a way of seeing the world fresh, don't they? They remind us that there's always something new to discover, even in familiar places." Jameson found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the warmth in her voice when she spoke of teaching. "What do you teach them about Christmas?" he asked, surprised by his own curiosity. "Oh, the usual stories, of course," Eliza replied, her eyes brightening. "But I also try to help them understand that Christmas is about more than receiving gifts. It's about recognizing the gifts we already have: family, friendship, the chance to start fresh." She glanced around the elegant dining room. "Some of my students come from homes where Christmas dinner might be nothing more than beans and cornbread, but they understand joy in ways that might surprise you." The comment hung in the air without judgment, yet Jameson felt the weight of it. Here he sat in a house that could shelter a dozen families, eating food that cost more than some folks earned in a month, yet he felt emptier than he had in years. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had everything a man was supposed to want, yet he sat across from a woman who'd lost her husband and lived on a teacher's modest salary, and she seemed to possess something he couldn't name or buy. Judge Burke watched the interplay with growing satisfaction. He could see his son's interest kindling, could see the way Jameson's usually guarded expression softened when Eliza spoke. More importantly, he could see the quality in this young woman that reminded him so strongly of his late wife, the combination of strength and gentleness, the ability to find meaning in simple things, the courage to continue building a life after devastating loss. The conversation drifted to safer topics: the weather, the condition of the roads, plans for the various Christmas celebrations around the county. Yet, beneath the polite exchange, something else was building. Jameson found himself storing away small details: the way Eliza's eyebrows drew together slightly when she was thinking, the musical quality of her laugh when Judge Burke told a mildly amusing story about his courtroom experiences, the unconscious grace with which she moved. For her part, Eliza was discovering that Jameson Burke was not quite the man she'd expected. The stories around town painted him as aloof, perhaps arrogant, a rich man's son who'd inherited everything and earned nothing. Yet as the evening progressed, she glimpsed something different. When he spoke about the ranch, his love for the land was evident. When Martha appeared to refill water glasses, his thanks was genuine and warm, speaking to a man who valued those who served him rather than taking them for granted. And when he listened, really listened to her stories about teaching, she sensed a loneliness in him that matched her own. The meal wound toward its conclusion with Martha's famous apple pie, the crust flaky and golden, the filling sweet with cinnamon and nutmeg. Judge Burke regaled them with stories of Christmases past, painting pictures of the ranch during Jameson's childhood when his mother still lived, and the house rang with laughter. The old man's eyes grew soft with memory as he described Christmas mornings when Jameson was small, racing down the grand staircase in his nightshirt to see what treasures awaited under the massive tree that still dominated the front parlor. Yet even as the conversation warmed, an underlying tension remained. This was, after all, an arranged meeting, a polite attempt at matchmaking by well-meaning friends who believed that two lonely people might find comfort in each other's company. Both Jameson and Eliza were painfully aware of the expectations hovering unspoken around the table, and both felt the weight of trying to live up to hopes they weren't sure they shared. As Martha cleared the dessert plates and brought coffee in delicate china cups, Jameson felt the moment approaching when he would need to either extend the evening or bring it to a polite close. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Eliza was lovely, intelligent, and clearly possessed qualities any sensible man would admire. Yet he felt like an actor playing a role he'd never learned, stumbling through lines that should have come naturally. The coffee grew cold in their cups as conversation became increasingly strained. Judge Burke, sensing his son's struggle, began to feel his own disappointment. He'd been so certain that these two would see in each other what he saw so clearly, two good people who could build something meaningful together if they could just get past their own defenses. Eliza glanced at the tall grandfather clock standing sentinel in the corner of the room, its steady tick marking the passage of an evening that had promised much, but delivered little more than polite conversation and growing awkwardness. She began to gather herself mentally for departure, already composing the gracious words she would use to thank Judge Burke for his hospitality and Jameson for his company, all while trying to soften the clear disappointment of an evening that had failed to kindle any spark of real connection. It was then that Jameson pushed back his chair and stood, his intention clear in the finality of the movement. Jameson's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as he rose, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet dining room like a gavel falling. The movement carried with it an air of finality that made Eliza's heart sink, though she couldn't quite say why. Perhaps it was the recognition that this evening, this attempt at connection, that had begun with such hope, was ending before it had truly begun. "Miss Thorne," Jameson began, his voice formal and distant, the warmth that had briefly flickered during their conversation about teaching now thoroughly extinguished. "I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you'll forgive me, but I have some ranch business to attend to early in the morning, and I should—" Judge Burke had been watching the entire exchange with growing frustration. For 30 years on the bench, he'd witnessed countless moments when the right word or action could change the course of a life, and he'd learned to recognize those crucial turning points. This was one of them. His son was about to walk away from something precious, something that might not come again, and all because of fear, the same fear that had nearly cost the judge his own happiness all those years ago. The old man rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his weathered hand finding his son's shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of 6 decades of hard-earned wisdom. Judge Burke's eyes met his son's, and in that gaze, Jameson saw something he hadn't expected, not disappointment or anger, but understanding tinged with profound sadness. "Son," Judge Burke said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the hushed room, "she's the one. Don't be blind like I was." The words hit Jameson like a physical blow. He knew the story. Every child in the county knew the story of Judge Burke and his beloved Sarah. How the young lawyer had been too proud, too afraid of rejection to court the banker's daughter properly. How he'd spent months making excuses and finding reasons to delay, convinced that a woman of her beauty and intelligence would never choose a rough country lawyer with more ambition than polish. How he'd nearly lost her to another suitor, a man with better prospects and smoother words, before finally finding the courage to speak his heart. "I was so worried about being worthy of your mother," Judge Burke continued, his voice growing stronger with memory, "that I almost forgot to show her what was in my heart. I almost let my own fears rob us both of 43 years of happiness." His grip tightened on Jameson's shoulder. "Don't make my mistake, boy. Don't let pride and fear cost you what could be the best thing that ever happened to you." Eliza sat frozen in her chair, her coffee cup halfway to her lips, as the weight of the old man's words settled over the room. She could see the conflict playing across Jameson's features, the surprise, the recognition, the struggle between ingrained caution and something deeper that was fighting to break free. The moment stretched taut between them, charged with possibility and fraught with the risk of revelation. "Judge Burke," Eliza said softly, setting down her cup with trembling fingers. "Perhaps I should—" "No," Jameson said, the word coming out rougher than he intended. He sank back into his chair, as if his legs had suddenly forgotten their purpose, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "Please don't go. Not yet." For the first time all evening, he truly looked at her, not the polite glances of dinner conversation, not the careful assessment of a man considering a potential bride, but the honest gaze of someone seeing another person clearly. What he found there took his breath away. Behind her composed exterior, behind the careful politeness and gracious manners, he glimpsed something raw and real: hope warring with resignation, longing held carefully in check, and a loneliness that matched his own so perfectly it made his chest ache. "I've been doing this all wrong," Jameson said, his voice barely steadying as he spoke words he'd never intended to say. "Sitting here like we're negotiating a business arrangement instead of—" He paused, struggling to find language for feelings he'd kept locked away for so long, instead of just talking to each other. Like people. Like two people who might actually have something to offer each other. Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the way the careful walls they'd both erected throughout the evening were beginning to crumble. "I thought you were going to politely send me home," she admitted, her own carefully maintained composure beginning to slip. "I thought I'd failed some test. I didn't even know I was taking." "No test," Jameson said, leaning forward across the table that had seemed like an ocean between them just moments before. "No expectations. No arrangements or agreements or any of the things that brought us here tonight." He paused, gathering courage for honesty that felt more dangerous than anything he'd ever attempted. "Just us. Just this moment. Just the truth." Judge Burke settled back into his chair with a satisfied expression, recognizing the moment when his intervention was no longer needed. He'd seen this transformation countless times in his courtroom, the moment when pretense fell away and people began to speak from the heart rather than from fear. It was always beautiful to witness, but tonight it held special meaning because it was his son finally learning the lesson it had taken the judge far too long to learn himself. "The truth," Eliza repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "I'm not sure I remember how to do truth anymore. I've been so careful for so long, so afraid of—" She stopped herself, then took a breath and continued. "So afraid of feeling too much again, of hoping for things that might not come, of opening my heart to someone who might not want what I have to offer." "What do you have to offer?" Jameson asked, and the question came out with such genuine curiosity, such complete absence of judgment, that Eliza felt something inside her chest begin to unfurl like a flower that had been waiting through a long winter for the first touch of spring. "I don't know anymore," she said honestly. "I used to know exactly who I was, Daniel's wife, a woman with a home and a future all mapped out. When he died, all of that died with him, and I've been trying to figure out who I am without him ever since." She looked down at her hands, then back up at Jameson, with eyes that held 3 years of carefully contained grief. "I suppose I'm still learning, still becoming whatever I'm meant to be next." Jameson felt something shift inside him at her words, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or compatibility or any of the practical considerations that had brought them together tonight. Here was someone who understood transformation, who knew what it meant to have your life change in an instant and find yourself suddenly responsible for becoming someone entirely new. He'd felt that same disorientation when his mother died, and he'd inherited not just the ranch, but the weight of being the last Burke to carry on the family name. "I know about becoming someone new," he said quietly. About waking up one day and realizing the person you thought you were doesn't exist anymore, and you have to figure out what comes next. He traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger, his eyes distant. When my mother died, everyone expected me to just step into her place, be the gracious host, the keeper of traditions, the one who makes everything feel like home for everyone else. But I don't know how to do any of that. I can run a ranch, I can make money, I can handle business, but making a home, making a life worth living, I'm not sure I have the first clue. The honesty of his admission hung between them like a bridge, spanning the distance that had seemed insurmountable just minutes before. Eliza reached across the table without thinking, her fingers brushing against his hand, the briefest contact, but it sent warmth shooting up both their arms with surprising intensity. "Maybe that's something we could learn together," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them, before she could remind herself of all the reasons to be careful, to protect her heart, to avoid hope that might lead to disappointment. Jameson turned his hand palm up, catching her fingers before she could pull away. The touch was gentle, questioning rather than demanding, giving her every opportunity to retreat if she chose. Instead, she let her hand rest in his, marveling at the calluses that spoke of honest work, at the strength that was offered without pressure, at the simple human contact she'd been denying herself for far too long. The clock in the hallway chimed 10 times as Jameson and Eliza sat together in the front parlor, the Christmas tree casting dancing shadows on the walls from the lights Judge Burke had insisted on stringing himself just that morning. The evening had taken on a quality neither of them had expected: intimate without being presumptuous, honest without being overwhelming. They'd moved from the formal dining room at Eliza's suggestion, drawn by the warmth of the smaller space and the gentle glow of the Christmas decorations. "I haven't sat in a parlor like this since I was a child visiting my grandmother," Eliza said, settling into the deep burgundy armchair that had been Judge Burke's wife's favorite. She had antimacassars on every piece of furniture and a piano that nobody was allowed to touch except on Sundays. She smiled at the memory. "I used to think grown-up houses were the most elegant places in the world." Jameson found himself relaxing for the first time all evening, leaning back in his father's leather chair and studying the way the firelight played across Eliza's features. "My mother used to play that piano," he said, gesturing toward the grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. "Every Christmas Eve, she'd play carols while my father and I sang along badly. In my case, she had the voice of an angel, but she was patient enough to let us massacre her favorite songs year after year." "Do you still play?" Eliza asked, her eyes bright with genuine interest. "God, no," Jameson laughed, the sound more genuine than any he'd made all evening. "I couldn't carry a tune if it had handles, but I loved listening to her. Sometimes I catch Martha humming those same carols while she works, and it's like having a piece of my mother back for just a moment." Judge Burke had excused himself shortly after they'd moved to the parlor, claiming fatigue but really wanting to give the young people space to discover whatever it was that might be growing between them. His retreat had been accomplished with the subtle grace of a man who understood exactly when his presence was helpful and when it might be an hindrance. The conversation meandered through safer territory, childhood memories, favorite books, the peculiarities of small-town life. Yet underneath the surface pleasantries, both of them were acutely aware of the shift that had occurred in the dining room. The careful barriers they'd maintained throughout dinner had crumbled, replaced by something more fragile but infinitely more promising, the tentative beginnings of genuine connection. "Tell me about your teaching," Jameson said, settling deeper into his chair and giving her his complete attention. "What made you choose that? I mean, after—" He paused, suddenly unsure if mentioning her husband's death would shatter the easy atmosphere they'd created. "After Daniel died," Eliza finished gently, showing no sign of the pain he'd expected. "It's all right to talk about him. He was a good man, and our marriage was a happy one. I don't want to pretend he never existed." She smoothed her skirt with careful hands, her expression thoughtful. "But you asked about teaching. I suppose I chose it because children don't expect you to be someone you're not. They don't care if you're struggling to figure out your life or if you sometimes feel lost. They just want you to help them learn, to listen when they talk, to be present for them." Jameson found himself leaning forward, drawn by the warmth in her voice when she spoke of her students. "That sounds like exactly what grown-ups need too, but they're usually too proud to ask for it." "Exactly," Eliza said, her smile becoming more animated. "Children are honest about what they need. If they're confused, they ask questions. If they're hurt, they cry. If they're happy, they laugh without worrying about whether it's appropriate. Adults spend so much energy pretending they have everything figured out that they forget how to be real with each other." The observation hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond its simple truth. Both of them recognized it as a description of how they'd spent most of the evening, pretending to be versions of themselves that would be acceptable to the other, rather than risking the vulnerability of authenticity. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," Jameson admitted, "about how much energy I spend trying to be what people expect a Burke to be instead of just being myself. Sometimes I wonder if I even know who that is anymore." Eliza studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the careful composure to something more uncertain underneath. "What would you do if you didn't have to be a Burke? If you could just be Jameson, whoever that turns out to be?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. He'd been asking himself variations of it for months, but no one had ever voiced it so simply. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think I'd travel more. See places that don't know the Burke name or care about the ranch. I'd like to learn things that have nothing to do with cattle or land management or maintaining the family reputation." He paused, then added with a self-deprecating smile, "I'd probably learn to cook something besides coffee and beans." "What's stopping you?" Eliza asked, and the question was posed without judgment, with genuine curiosity about the constraints he felt bound by. "Responsibility, I suppose. This ranch employs 32 people year-round, more during busy seasons. The town depends on the economic impact we generate. There are expectations." He stopped himself, recognizing the familiar weight of obligations that had shaped his choices for so long. "But maybe that's just an excuse. Maybe I'm afraid to find out what I'm like when I'm not defined by all of this." Eliza was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "When Daniel died," she said eventually, "I had to decide who I was going to be without him. It was terrifying, because I'd been Daniel's wife for so long that I'd forgotten how to be just Eliza. But there was something liberating about it too, the chance to discover parts of myself that I'd never had reason to explore." The parallel wasn't lost on either of them. They were both people in transition, both struggling to define themselves outside the roles that had previously given their lives structure and meaning. The recognition created another layer of connection, deeper than attraction or compatibility, the understanding that comes from shared experience of fundamental change. "Do you ever miss it?" Jameson asked. "Being defined by someone else, I mean. Having your place in the world so clearly established?" "Sometimes," Eliza admitted. "There was comfort in knowing exactly who I was supposed to be, what was expected of me. But there's something to be said for the freedom to choose, even if that freedom comes with uncertainty." She met his eyes across the space between their chairs. "I think maybe the best relationships are ones where you help each other become who you're meant to be, rather than trying to fit each other into predetermined roles." Outside, snow had begun to fall, fat, lazy flakes that drifted past the tall windows and added to the sense of intimacy in the warm room. Neither of them mentioned the weather, but both were aware of how the outside world seemed to have receded, leaving just this space, this conversation, this unexpected evening that had begun with such awkwardness and evolved into something neither had dared hope for. The grandfather clock chimed 11, and Eliza startled slightly at the sound. "I should go," she said. though her tone suggested she was saying it because she felt she should, not because she wanted to. "I have school tomorrow, and Mrs. Patterson will be watching for my lamp to go out to make sure I'm keeping proper hours." Jameson felt a stab of disappointment at the mention of her leaving, but he recognized the practical necessity. Of course. But he paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to ask. "Would you consider having dinner with me again? Tomorrow night, perhaps? Just the two of us this time." Eliza's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire countenance, and Jameson realized he'd been holding his breath waiting for her answer. "I'd like that very much," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Though perhaps I could cook for you this time. It seems only fair after Martha went to such trouble tonight." "You don't have to," Jameson began, but she held up a gentle hand. "I want to," she said firmly. "Besides, I suspect you haven't had a home-cooked meal in a kitchen that wasn't designed to feed an army. There's something different about cooking in a small space where every pot and pan has a story." She gathered her shawl from the back of the chair, her movements graceful despite the late hour. "Come to the teacherage at 6 tomorrow. It's the little house behind the schoolhouse. You can't miss it." As Jameson helped her into her coat, his fingers brushed against her neck as he lifted her hair free of the collar. The contact was brief, innocent, yet it sent warmth racing through both of them. For a moment they stood closer than propriety strictly allowed, both acutely aware of the other's presence, of the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of the way his hands lingered a beat longer than necessary. "Thank you," Eliza whispered, and though she was ostensibly thanking him for helping with her coat, they both understood she meant something larger. "Thank you for this evening, for the honesty, for the unexpected gift of connection when she'd nearly given up hope of finding it again." The drive back to town was conducted in Judge Burke's finest carriage, with Timothy, the ranch's most trusted hand, handling the reins with the careful precision of a man who understood he was transporting something precious. Jameson rode beside Eliza, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body in the cold December air, far enough apart to maintain the appearance of propriety that the small town would expect. They spoke little during the ride, but the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. The companionable quiet of two people who had discovered they understood each other in ways that didn't require constant conversation to maintain. When Timothy pulled the carriage up in front of the small white house behind the schoolhouse, Jameson stepped down first and offered his hand to help Eliza alight. "Thank you for this evening," he said, still holding her gloved hand in his. "I haven't talked to anyone the way we talked tonight in longer than I can remember." "Neither have I," Eliza admitted. "It felt—" She paused, searching for the right word. "It felt like coming home, somehow, like finding a part of myself I didn't know was missing." They stood there for a moment in the snow-quiet night, neither wanting to be the first to break the spell of the evening. Finally, Eliza gently withdrew her hand and stepped back toward her door. 6 o'clock tomorrow," she reminded him, her breath visible in small puffs in the cold air. "I'll be here," Jameson promised, and they both knew he meant much more than simply arriving for dinner. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a fairy tale. Jameson found himself moving through his usual ranch duties with an energy and focus that surprised his men. He inspected fences with more attention than usual, discussed feed schedules with greater interest, and even found himself humming badly, as he'd warned Eliza, while checking on the pregnant mares in the breeding barn. "You seem mighty cheerful this morning," observed Ben Martinez, the ranch foreman who'd worked for the Burke family for 15 years. "That dinner party go better than expected?" Jameson felt heat rise in his cheeks at the good-natured teasing. "Maybe it did," he admitted, unable to suppress a smile. "Ben, what do you know about courting a lady properly? I mean, beyond the basic politeness my mother taught me." Ben's weathered face split into a grin. "Well now, that's a question I haven't heard from you before. This, about Miss Thorne, I'm guessing." When Jameson nodded, Ben's expression grew more serious. "She's a fine woman, Mr. Burke. Lost her husband young, but she's made something good of her life anyway. The children in town adore her, and that says something about a person's character." "What would you do?" Jameson asked, genuinely seeking advice. "If you were trying to show someone you were serious about getting to know them better." Ben considered the question while checking the latch on a stall door. "I reckon the trick is paying attention to what matters to her, not just what you think should matter. My Elena always said the best courting happened when a man took time to learn who she really was, not just what she looked like or what she could do for him." He glanced at Jameson with eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "Sounds like you're already on the right track if you're asking the question." Meanwhile, across town in the one-room schoolhouse, Eliza was having her own struggles with concentration. She'd assigned her students quiet reading time and found herself staring out the frost-covered windows toward the mountains, her mind wandering to the previous evening and the unexpected turn her life had taken. "Miss Thorne?" came a small voice from the front row. "Are you all right? You look different today." Eliza turned her attention to Lucy Patterson, an observant 8-year-old with bright eyes and an unfortunate tendency to voice whatever thoughts crossed her mind. "Different how, Lucy?" "Happy," Lucy said decisively. "Like when my mama gets letters from my grandmama back east, like something good happened." From the mouths of babes, Eliza thought, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "Perhaps something good did happen, Lucy. Sometimes grown-ups have nice surprises too." "Is it because of the man who brought you home last night?" asked Tommy Patterson, Lucy's older brother, who possessed the same keen observational skills, but had learned to be more subtle about deploying them. "Mrs. Henderson saw the Burke carriage at your house and told Mama this morning." Eliza should have known that in a town the size of theirs, nothing happened without the entire population knowing about it by breakfast time. "Mr. Burke was kind enough to escort me home after dinner at his father's house," she said carefully. "It was simply good manners." The children exchanged glances that suggested they found this explanation less than completely satisfying, but they were too well trained to press the matter further. Still, Eliza noticed an unusual number of small smiles and whispered conversations throughout the morning, and she suspected that by lunchtime, every family in town would know that their schoolteacher had been seen in the company of the county's most eligible bachelor. The afternoon passed with unusual swiftness as Eliza found herself planning the evening's menu with more care than she'd devoted to any meal since her husband's death. She decided on roast chicken with herb stuffing, mashed potatoes with cream and butter, green beans from her own preserved stores, and biscuits that she knew from experience turned out light and fluffy when she took the time to do them properly. For dessert, she'd attempt her grandmother's apple cake, a recipe she'd been afraid to try since Daniel died, but which seemed appropriate for this particular evening. By 4 o'clock, she'd dismissed her students and begun the familiar ritual of transforming her simple kitchen into something that could welcome a guest properly. As she worked peeling potatoes, seasoning the chicken, mixing biscuit dough, she found herself humming the same Christmas carols that Jameson had mentioned his mother playing. The coincidence made her smile and feel connected to the woman she'd never met, but whose son had somehow found his way into her carefully guarded heart in the span of a single evening. Jameson arrived at the teacherage precisely at 6, carrying a bouquet of winter roses from Martha's carefully tended greenhouse and wearing his best suit. Though he'd deliberately chosen the simpler of his formal outfits, instinctively understanding that ostentation would be out of place in Eliza's modest home. The teacherage was exactly as she'd described it, a small white clapboard house with green shutters and a front porch that would be charming in summer when morning glories climbed the posts, but which now wore a coating of snow that made it look like something from a Christmas card. The warm glow from the windows and the scent of roasting chicken that met him at the door spoke of comfort rather than grandeur, of a home created through care and attention rather than money and status. When Eliza opened the door, dressed in a simple green wool dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Jameson felt his breath catch in his throat, not because she was wearing anything elaborate, but because she looked so completely, naturally beautiful in her own space. "Come in out of the cold," she said, taking his coat and hanging it on a simple wooden peg by the door. "I hope you don't mind the informality. This house doesn't really allow for much ceremony." "It's perfect," Jameson said, and meant it. The front room was small but welcoming, with a braided rug on the polished wooden floors, bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, and a fireplace just large enough to heat the space without overwhelming it. Everything was clean and well cared for, but there was a lived-in quality that spoke of someone who actually used their home rather than simply inhabiting it for show. "These are beautiful," Eliza said, accepting the roses with genuine pleasure. "Martha's roses? I've heard she has a gift with flowers, but I've never seen them up close." She buried her face in the blooms, inhaling their delicate fragrance. "They smell like summer. What a lovely thing to bring to a winter dinner." As she arranged the flowers in a simple glass vase, Jameson found himself studying the details of her home with the fascination of someone seeing how another person actually lived. The books on her shelves ranged from practical volumes on teaching methods to poetry, philosophy, and novels, a collection that spoke of someone with wide-ranging interests and the time to pursue them. On the mantelpiece sat a daguerreotype of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her late husband, Jameson realized, and felt a surprising lack of jealousy at the sight. Instead, he felt grateful that she'd loved someone worthy of her, that she'd experienced the kind of marriage that left her capable of loving again rather than bitter or closed off. "Tell me about your books," he said, drawn to the shelves like iron filings to a magnet. "I haven't seen a personal library like this outside my father's study." Eliza's face brightened with the particular joy that book lovers share when they find a kindred spirit. "Most of them were Daniel's," she said, running her fingers along the spines with affection. "He was always reading something history, literature, scientific journals when he could get them. After he died, people suggested I might want to sell them, since they were taking up so much space, but I couldn't bear to part with them. They're like having conversations with him still." She pulled down a worn volume of Emerson's essays and handed it to Jameson. This was his favorite. He used to read passages aloud to me while I worked in the garden or mended clothes. Self-reliance was the one he returned to most often. She smiled at the memory. He said it reminded him that a person's worth didn't come from what others thought of them, but from how true they stayed to their own conscience. Jameson opened the book and found the margins filled with careful notes in a masculine hand, observations, questions, agreements, and disagreements with the author's philosophy. It was like glimpsing into the mind of the man who'd shaped Eliza's understanding of love and partnership, and rather than feeling threatened by this insight into her past, Jameson found himself wishing he could have met Daniel Thorne, this man who'd clearly been worthy of her devotion. "He sounds like he was a remarkable person," Jameson said, closing the book carefully and handing it back to her. "He was," Eliza agreed simply, "but he's gone, and I'm here, and life continues to unfold in ways neither of us could have predicted." She met Jameson's eyes directly. "I've learned that honoring someone's memory doesn't mean stopping your own life. Sometimes it means being open to new experiences they would have wanted you to have." The observation carried weight beyond its simple words, and Jameson understood that she was telling him something important about her readiness to move forward, to allow new relationships to develop without betraying the love she'd shared with her husband. It was a gift of honesty that required no response beyond his grateful acceptance. Dinner was served at a small table by the kitchen window, where they could see snow continuing to fall in the gathering darkness outside. The meal was simple but perfectly prepared, every dish seasoned with care and presented with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of someone who understood that feeding another person was an act of nurture and welcome. They ate by candlelight, not from any attempt at romance, but because Eliza preferred the soft glow to the harsher light of the oil lamps. "This chicken is incredible," Jameson said, meaning every word. "I haven't tasted anything like it since my mother cooked for our family." "It's nothing fancy," Eliza said, pleased by his obvious enjoyment. "Just herbs from my garden and patience. My grandmother always said the secret to good cooking was taking time to do things properly, not rushing through to get to the end." "Is that where you learned? From your grandmother?" "She taught me the basics," Eliza nodded. "But Daniel and I learned together, really. He was a better cook than I was when we married. His mother had died when he was young, and his father taught him to fend for himself. We used to experiment with recipes, try new things, sometimes fail spectacularly." She laughed at some memory. "We once tried to make a cake for his birthday, and somehow managed to create something that had the texture of leather and tasted like salt. We ate it anyway, and declared it the worst cake in the history of baking." Jameson found himself laughing at the image, charmed by the picture of two young people so happy together that even their failures became fond memories. "What would you cook if you could make anything? If money and ingredients were no object?" Eliza considered the question seriously. "I think I'd like to learn to cook food from other places. French pastries, maybe, or the kind of spicy dishes they make down in Mexico. I've read about foods from different countries, but I've never had the chance to try them." She paused, then added with a slightly wistful tone, "Daniel and I used to talk about traveling someday, seeing how people lived in other places. We never got the chance, but I still think about it sometimes." The mention of unrealized dreams hung between them, not sadly, but with the kind of gentle melancholy that comes from acknowledging roads not taken. Jameson felt a sudden, powerful desire to offer her those experiences, to show her the wider world she'd only read about, to give her adventures that would honor both her past love and her present self. "Where would you go first?" he asked. "If you could go anywhere." "Paris, I think," she said without hesitation. "Not for the fancy society or the grand buildings, but for the bookshops. I've read that there are streets lined with nothing but books, places where scholars and writers gather to discuss ideas. That sounds like paradise to me." The evening stretched on with the kind of easy conversation that feels like coming home, yet as the clock neared 9, Jameson noticed a subtle shift in Eliza's demeanor. She became quieter, more thoughtful, occasionally glancing toward the window where snow continued to accumulate against the glass. When she excused herself to clear the dessert plates, he followed her to the small kitchen, unwilling to let the distance between them grow, even for the few moments it would take her to wash dishes. "Let me help," he said, rolling up his sleeves without waiting for permission. "It's the least I can do after such a wonderful meal." Eliza looked surprised but pleased. "You don't need to. I'm sure you've never washed a dish in your life." "Then it's time I learned," Jameson replied with a grin that made her heart skip. "Besides, my mother always said the best conversations happen while doing ordinary things together." They worked side by side in the cramped space, Jameson washing while Eliza dried and put things away. It was domestic and intimate in a way that neither had expected, their arms occasionally brushing as they moved around each other, their conversation flowing as easily as if they'd been doing this dance for years rather than days. "Eliza," Jameson said as he handed her the last plate, "what's troubling you? You've seemed distant since we finished eating." She paused in her drying, looking down at the simple white china in her hands. "It's foolish, really. It's just—" She set the plate down carefully and turned to face him. "This feels dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "This," she said, gesturing between them with a helpless wave of her hand. "Us. This feeling like maybe I could be happy again in ways I thought were lost to me forever. It's terrifying, Jameson. What if I'm wrong? What if this is just loneliness, dressed up as something more meaningful? What if you realize I'm not who you think I am?" Jameson dried his hands on the dish towel, and then, very gently, took her hands in his. "What if you're exactly who I think you are, and that's wonderful? What if this isn't loneliness but recognition? What if we're both brave enough to see where this leads, instead of talking ourselves out of it before it has a chance to grow? I was married for 8 years, Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know what love feels like, what it requires, what it costs. I'm not some young girl who thinks romance solves everything. I know that building a life with someone requires work and sacrifice and the willingness to choose each other even when it's hard. I'm counting on that, Jameson said seriously. I don't want a fairy tale, Eliza. I want something real, something that can weather storms and grow stronger over time. I want what you had with Daniel, but I want it with you. The honesty of his words hit her like a physical force. She'd been so afraid that any man interested in her would either want to compete with her late husband's memory or expect her to forget him entirely. Jameson was offering something different, the possibility of a love that honored her past while creating something entirely new. The town is already talking, she said, trying to find solid ground in practical concerns. Mrs. Henderson has made it her personal mission to keep track of every carriage that stops at my door. By Sunday, half the congregation will be planning our wedding, and the other half will be convinced I'm a loose woman for entertaining a man unchaperoned. Jameson couldn't help but smile at her description, even as he recognized the real concern beneath it. In a town this size, reputation mattered, and a schoolteacher's reputation mattered more than most. Then perhaps we should give them something definite to talk about instead of leaving them to speculate. Eliza's eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean, I'd like to court you properly, openly. I want to take you to the Christmas social next week, to church on Sunday, to dinner at the hotel where everyone can see us together. I want there to be no question about my intentions or your character. And what are your intentions? Eliza asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jameson was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. My intention is to discover whether what I think I'm feeling is real and lasting. My intention is to learn everything about you that there is, to know your favorite time of day, what makes you laugh, how you like your coffee, what you dream about when you can't sleep. My intention is to see if we can build something together that honors both of our pasts while creating a future neither of us could imagine alone. The kitchen felt even smaller, with the weight of his words filling the space between them. Eliza could feel her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the steady warmth of his gaze, under the promise implicit in everything he'd said. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of you, but of hoping for something I might lose again. I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive another loss like Daniel. You are strong enough, Jameson said with quiet certainty. You've already proven that by surviving his death and building a meaningful life anyway. But Eliza, living means risking loss. The alternative is just existing, and you're too vibrant, too full of life, to settle for mere existence. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the storm building beyond the warm circle of her kitchen. Jameson glanced toward the window, then back at Eliza with the expression that mixed reluctance with responsibility. I should go, he said. The weather's getting worse, and I don't want you to have to worry about me getting home safely. But as he reached for his coat, Eliza caught his arm. The touch was brief, but it stopped him completely. Stay, she said, then immediately colored at how that sounded. I mean, just until the snow stops. You can sleep on the sofa. It wouldn't be proper to send you out in a storm, and it wouldn't be proper for me to worry all night about whether you made it home safely. Jameson searched her face, trying to read the emotions playing across her features. Are you sure? I don't want to compromise your reputation or put you in an uncomfortable position. I'm sure, Eliza said, and realized as she spoke the words that she truly was. Besides, if the gossips are already talking, one more night won't make much difference, and this way I won't spend the evening imagining you frozen in a snowbank somewhere. The practical concern in her voice was genuine, But underneath it, Jameson heard something else, the desire to extend their time together, to not quite let go of the evening that had brought them so much closer to understanding each other. The storm outside provided a perfect excuse for what they both wanted anyway: more time in this warm, intimate space where the outside world and its expectations couldn't intrude. "All right," he agreed, "but only if you're completely comfortable with the arrangement." Eliza smiled, feeling lighter than she had since before Daniel's death. "I'm comfortable," she said, "more comfortable than I've been in a very long time." The morning brought brilliant sunshine, reflecting off fresh snow that had transformed the landscape into something magical and pristine. Jameson woke on Eliza's narrow sofa with a crick in his neck and the kind of contentment he hadn't felt in years. They'd spent the evening talking by the fire about books, dreams, the peculiarities of small-town life, until the storm finally quieted, and they'd both grown too drowsy to continue. She'd brought him quilts that smelled faintly of lavender and wished him a soft good night that had echoed in his mind long after she'd disappeared into her bedroom. He was folding the bedding when Eliza emerged from her room, already dressed for the day and looking remarkably fresh for someone who'd stayed up too late talking. "Coffee?" she asked, moving toward the kitchen with the easy efficiency of someone comfortable in their own space. "Please," Jameson said, then paused as he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. "Are you expecting someone?" Eliza frowned, moving to the window to peer out at the early morning visitor. "That's odd. It's barely 7 o'clock." And her face went pale as she recognized the rider. "It's Tommy Patterson. He looks upset." The boy was indeed upset, practically falling off his horse in his haste to reach the door. When Eliza opened it, he burst into speech without preamble. "Miss Thorne, you have to come quick. There's been an accident at the Burke ranch, a fire in the main barn, and Judge Burke got caught trying to save some of the horses. Doc Williams is there, but he says," the boy's voice cracked with emotion, "he says you should come if you want to say goodbye." The coffee cup slipped from Eliza's nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. Behind her, Jameson had gone deadly still, the color draining from his face as the words hit him like physical blows. "How bad?" Jameson managed to ask, though his voice sounded strange and distant even to his own ears. "Real bad, Mr. Burke," Tommy said, his young face creased with the weight of delivering such terrible news. "The whole barn's gone, and your pa, he was trying to get thunder out of his stall when part of the roof came down. Doc Williams says his lungs got too much smoke, and there's burns." Jameson was already reaching for his coat, his movements sharp and desperate. "I have to go. I have to get to him." "Of course," Eliza said, her own shock giving way to the kind of calm efficiency that emerged in crisis. "Tommy, can you get word to Mrs. Patterson that school is cancelled today? Tell her I'll send notice when we know more." She was already moving toward her own coat, her decision made without conscious thought. "Eliza, you don't need to," Jameson began, but she cut him off. "Yes, I do. You shouldn't be alone right now, and your father." Her voice caught slightly. "Judge Burke has been kind to me. If there's anything I can do, I want to be there." The ride to the ranch was a blur of snow-covered fields and desperate urgency. Jameson had insisted on riding his own horse, which Tommy had thoughtfully brought from the ranch, while Eliza rode behind Tommy on his mount. The cold air bit at their faces, but none of them felt it through the haze of shock and fear that surrounded them like a physical thing. The Burke ranch, usually a picture of prosperity and order, was a scene of controlled chaos. The main barn, a massive structure that had housed 30 horses and stored feed for the winter, was nothing but smoking ruins and blackened timbers. Men moved purposefully through the wreckage, searching for any animals that might have survived, while others worked to contain the damage and prevent the fire from spreading to other buildings. Martha met them at the front door of Willow Hall, her usually composed face streaked with tears and soot. "Oh, Jameson," she said, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "I'm so sorry. We tried to stop him, but you know how he is about those horses. He got Thunder and Buttercup out. But when he went back for Old Bell—" "Where is he?" Jameson asked, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. "Upstairs, in the master bedroom. Doc Williams is with him, and Pastor Morrison just arrived." Martha's eyes were kind, but didn't hide the gravity of the situation. "He's been asking for you." Jameson took the stairs 2 at a time, with Eliza following at a more measured pace, giving him space, but staying close enough to offer support if needed. The sight that greeted them in the master bedroom was one that would be burned into both their memories forever. Judge Burke lay propped against white pillows, his weathered face pale, except for the angry red of burns along his left cheek and neck. His breathing was labored and shallow, punctuated by fits of coughing that brought flecks of blood to his lips. Doc Williams looked up as they entered, his expression grave, but not entirely without hope. "Jameson," Judge Burke wheezed, his eyes lighting up with relief at the sight of his son. Good, you're here. We need to talk, son. Important things to say." "Don't try to talk, Pa," Jameson said, moving to kneel beside the bed and taking his father's hand in both of his. "Just rest. You're going to be fine. Doc Williams is the best doctor in 3 counties, and—" "Son," Judge Burke interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded courtrooms even in its weakened state. "Don't lie to an old man who's been lying to himself for weeks. We both know what this is." He looked past Jameson to where Eliza stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Miss Thorne." "Good. You're here too. Come closer, child. I have things to tell you both." Eliza moved forward reluctantly, feeling like an intruder on this most private of moments, yet unable to deny the request of a dying man who had shown her nothing but kindness. "The burns aren't what's killing me," Judge Burke said, his eyes moving between his son and Eliza. "Been feeling poorly for months now, heart giving out," Doc Williams says. "Didn't want to worry you, son. Didn't want to spoil your last memories of your old PR with sickness and slow dying." He coughed again, more violently this time. "This fire, it's almost a mercy, quick and clean, instead of wasting away in a sick bed." "Pa, no," Jameson said, his voice breaking. "You can't leave me. Not now. Not when I'm just figuring out how to live, how to be happy." Judge Burke's eyes softened with infinite tenderness. "But you are figuring it out, son. Last night, when you didn't come home, Martha told me where you were, told me about the storm I knew you'd found, what I'd been hoping you'd find. Someone who sees who you really are, not just what you own or what name you carry." He turned his attention to Eliza, his breathing becoming more labored with each word. "Miss Thorne, I need to ask something of you. This boy, he's got a good heart, but he's going to need help learning how to use it. His mother and I, we loved him well, but maybe protected him too much from the hard parts of life. He's going to need someone who understands that real love isn't just the easy times, it's choosing to stay when things get difficult." "Judge Burke," Eliza whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "You shouldn't be worrying about us. I should be making sure my son doesn't make the same mistakes I did," the old man said firmly. "I almost lost his mother because I was too proud to tell her how I felt. Don't let him do that. Don't let either of you do that. Life's too short and too precious to waste time being afraid of love." As if summoned by his words, Martha appeared in the doorway with Pastor Morrison, a gentle man who'd officiated at more deathbeds than he cared to remember. The pastor's presence seemed to underscore the reality that everyone in the room was trying to deny. Judge Burke looked at his son one last time, his eyes holding a lifetime of love and pride. "Take care of each other," he whispered. "And take care of this place. It's not about the money or the land, it's about being a home where love can grow. Promise me." "I promise, Pa," Jameson said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I promise everything." Judge Burke passed quietly just after sunset on December 23rd, with his son holding his hand and Eliza sitting nearby, her presence a comfort to both men in those final hours. His last words were spoken so softly that only Jameson could hear them. "She's the one, son. Don't let fear steal what God's given you." The days that followed were a blur of necessary arrangements and overwhelming grief. The entire county seemed to descend upon Willow Hall to pay their respects to a man who had presided over their lives with fairness and wisdom for 3 decades. Martha moved through the house like a general organizing troops, coordinating the endless parade of visitors bringing food, flowers, and condolences. Eliza found herself swept into the preparations almost without conscious choice, helping Martha receive guests, organizing the kitchen, and quietly managing the 1,000 small details that death demands of the living. "I don't know what we would have done without you, dear," Martha said on the morning of the funeral, catching Eliza's hands in her work-roughened ones. "You've been a godsend these past few days, and I know Judge Burke would be grateful to see how you've looked after Jameson." Indeed, Eliza had barely left the ranch since the morning of the fire, sleeping in one of the guest rooms and maintaining a quiet, steady presence that seemed to anchor Jameson to reality when grief threatened to unmoor him entirely. She'd watched him struggle with the weight of sudden responsibility decisions about the ranch, the funeral arrangements, the 100 different ways that inheriting his father's life required him to become someone new overnight. The church was packed for the funeral service, with people standing in the back and spilling out onto the front steps despite the December cold. Pastor Morrison delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of Judge Burke's character, his fairness, his wisdom, his deep love for his family and community. But it was Jameson's own words, spoken in a voice that trembled but held, that brought tears to every eye in the church. "My father taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by how much love he gives and how much good he does with the time he's been granted," Jameson said, looking out over the sea of faces that had known and respected his father. "He taught me that real strength comes from serving others, that true wisdom comes from listening more than speaking, and that the most important legacy any of us can leave is the lives we've touched and the love we've shared." His eyes found Eliza in the front pew, and for a moment it was as if he was speaking directly to her. "He also taught me not to waste the precious time we're given, not to let fear or pride keep us from reaching for the happiness that's offered to us. I promised to honor his memory by living the kind of life he would be proud of, a life filled with purpose, service, and love." The burial was held in the family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, where Judge Burke was laid to rest beside his beloved Sarah under ancient oak trees that had watched over Burke graves for 4 generations. As the last shovelful of earth was placed over the coffin, Jameson felt the full weight of his inheritance settle on his shoulders, not just the ranch and the money and the responsibilities, but the legacy of being the last Burke, the one who would determine whether the family name continued with honor or died with him. The reception at Willow Hall that followed was a testament to the respect Judge Burke had earned over his lifetime. Ranchers and townspeople, lawyers and shopkeepers, rich and poor, all mingled in the elegant rooms, sharing stories of the judge's fairness, his kindness, his impact on their lives. Through it all, Eliza moved quietly at Jameson's side, offering support without drawing attention to herself, handling the social obligations that he was too grief-stricken to manage with his usual grace. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Jameson found himself standing in his father's study, staring at the empty chair behind the massive oak desk. The room still smelled of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books, still held the essence of the man who had shaped every aspect of Jameson's understanding of what it meant to be a good man. "He loved this room," came Eliza's soft voice from the doorway. "The books, the smell of his pipe, the way the afternoon light came through those tall windows. I could see it in his eyes whenever he spoke about the conversations you two had in here." Jameson turned to find her silhouetted against the late-day sun, still wearing the simple black dress she'd worn to the funeral, her face showing the strain of the past few days, but her eyes warm with compassion and understanding. "I don't know how to do this without him," Jameson admitted, the words coming out raw and honest. Run the ranch, yes, handle the business aspects, certainly, but be the kind of man he was? Be worthy of everything he built? I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not sure I can become. Eliza stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. You don't have to become him, Jameson. You just have to become the best version of yourself. Your father knew that it's why he wasn't worried about leaving all of this in your hands. Did he? Jameson asked, sinking into one of the leather chairs by the fireplace. Because I feel like I've been stumbling through my life without direction, and now suddenly I'm responsible for 32 families who depend on this ranch for their livelihood, for maintaining traditions that stretch back 4 generations, for he stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay before him. Eliza moved to sit in the chair across from him, the same chair she'd occupied during that first dinner when everything between them had seemed so uncertain. What did your father say to you at the end? Those last words, he whispered. Jameson met her eyes, seeing in them the same steady strength that had drawn him from the beginning. He said you were the one. He said not to let fear steal what God had given me. The silence that followed was charged with meaning, with all the words they'd been dancing around for days, with the reality of what they meant to each other that had been laid bare by grief and crisis. Jameson, Eliza said carefully, what we've shared these past few days, taking care of things together, being there for each other through this terrible time, it's shown me something I need to tell you. What's that? I love you. The words came out simply, without fanfare or dramatic declaration, but with the quiet certainty of someone stating an undeniable truth, not because of the ranch or the money or what people would think if we were together. I love the man who sits up all night worrying about whether his foreman's family has enough food for winter. I love the man who remembers the names of every child I teach and asks about their progress. I love the man who held his father's hand and promised to live a life filled with love. Jameson felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. In all his imaginings of how this conversation might unfold, he'd never pictured it happening like this in his father's study, in the aftermath of loss, with such simple honesty that it took his breath away. I love you too, he said, the words feeling both foreign and natural on his lips. I think I've loved you since that first night when you talked about your students with such warmth, when you showed me what it looked like to find meaning in simple things. He leaned forward, reaching for her hands. But Eliza, I don't want you to feel obligated because of what my father said, or because you've been so kind during these terrible days. I want... Stop, she said gently, squeezing his hands. Stop trying to give me reasons to change my mind. Stop looking for ways to protect me from making a choice you think I might regret. I'm not a young girl who doesn't understand what love requires. I'm a grown woman who's loved deeply before, who understands the risks and the rewards, and who's choosing to love you with full knowledge of what that choice means. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows of the study, but inside the circle of lamplight, surrounded by the wisdom of generations of Burke family history, Jameson felt something settle in his chest that he'd been searching for his entire adult life, the certainty that comes from finding where you belong. Then marry me, he said, the words coming out with surprising steadiness. Not because it's expected or convenient or what the town thinks should happen. Marry me because we love each other and because we want to build something together that honors both of our pasts while creating a future that's entirely our own. Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes, tears of joy mixed with the grief that had shadowed the past few days, tears that acknowledged both loss and hope, ending and beginning. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll help you carry the legacy your father left. Yes, I'll build a life with you that he would be proud of. And as the sun set over the snow-covered ranch on December 23rd, in the study where 4 generations of Burke men had made the decisions that shaped their family's destiny, Jameson Burke and Eliza Thorne sealed their commitment to each other with a kiss that tasted of tears and hope, and the promise of love that could weather any storm. Christmas Eve dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that seemed to promise new beginnings. Despite the recent loss, or perhaps because of it, Jameson and Eliza had decided to proceed with a simple ceremony at the small church where Judge Burke had been laid to rest just 2 days earlier. Pastor Morrison had initially expressed concern about the proximity of the wedding to the funeral, but when he saw the quiet certainty in both their faces, he understood that this was not a hasty decision born of grief, but rather a mature choice to embrace life and love in the face of mortality. The church was decorated for Christmas services with evergreen boughs and white ribbons, creating a setting that was both festive and reverent. A small group of witnesses had gathered Martha, who had insisted on making Eliza's simple blue dress more festive with a spray of winter roses at the shoulder. Ben Martinez and his wife, Elena, representing the ranch hands who had become Jameson's extended family. The Patterson family, including Tommy and Lucy, who had appointed themselves the unofficial ambassadors between the school and the community at large, and Dr. Williams, whose presence seemed to bless the union with the approval of the professional men who had respected Judge Burke. As Jameson stood at the altar in his father's best suit, altered by Martha's nimble fingers to fit his taller frame, he felt the presence of his parents as strongly as if they were seated in the front pew. His mother's pearl cufflinks caught the light from the stained glass windows, and his father's watch ticked steadily in his vest pocket, marking time that suddenly felt precious rather than endless. Eliza walked down the aisle without fanfare or processional music, carrying a simple bouquet of winter roses and evergreen that Martha had insisted upon. She had chosen to wear her best dress, the same blue wool she'd worn to their first dinner together, rather than purchasing something new. It seemed appropriate, somehow, to marry him in the dress he'd first seen her wear when their lives had begun to intertwine. As she approached the altar, Jameson felt his breath catch in his throat. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. She was walking toward him with the same quiet certainty she'd brought to everything over the past few days, the same steady grace that had carried them through crisis and loss and brought them to this moment of choosing each other, deliberately and completely. Pastor Morrison began the ceremony with words about love and commitment that seemed to carry extra weight in the aftermath of Judge Burke's death. We gather today not just to witness the union of Jameson and Eliza, but to celebrate the triumph of love over loss, of hope over fear, of the courage to build something beautiful even in the shadow of grief. When it came time for the vows, Jameson and Eliza had chosen to speak their own words rather than reciting traditional promises. They had written them separately, sitting by the fire in Judge Burke's study the evening before, but when they spoke, their promises seemed to echo and complement each other with the harmony of two people who had found their match. "Eliza," Jameson began, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him, "I promise to love you not just in the easy times, but especially when life tests us. I promise to build a home with you where love can grow and flourish, where children can learn what it means to be cherished, and where we can both become the people we're meant to be together. I promise to honor your past while helping you create a future that's beyond anything either of us could imagine alone." Eliza's response came without hesitation, her voice clear and strong in the small church. "Jameson, I promise to stand beside you as we carry forward the legacy your father entrusted to us. I promise to help you become the man I already see in your heart, generous, wise, and capable of great love. I promise to choose you every day, not because it's expected or convenient, but because loving you makes me more myself than I've ever been. I promise to build with you a life that honors both loss and joy, both memory and hope." As Pastor Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause that seemed to fill the church with warmth and celebration despite the modest size of the gathering. When Jameson kissed his bride, it was with the tender reverence of a man who understood exactly how precious the moment was. Not just the kiss, but the promise it represented, the future it opened, the family it would create. But even as they turned to face their friends and family as husband and wife, Jameson caught sight of a figure in the back of the church who made his blood run cold. Harold Blackstone, the lawyer from Denver who had been circling the ranch like a vulture since Judge Burke's death, stood in the shadows near the back door, his presence an ominous reminder that not everyone was celebrating this union. The wedding reception at Willow Hall was a modest affair, but it carried the warmth and joy that only comes from celebrations shared by people who genuinely care for each other. Martha had outdone herself with a feast that managed to be both elegant and comforting. Roasted ham with honey glaze, potatoes whipped with cream and butter, green beans from the ranch's own garden stores, and a wedding cake that was simple in decoration but rich with the flavors of vanilla and almond that had been Jameson's mother's favorites. As the newly married couple moved through the parlor greeting their guests, Eliza felt a profound sense of rightness about the choice they'd made. These weren't strangers offering polite congratulations. These were people who would become part of her daily life, who had already embraced her as one of their own during the difficult days following Judge Burke's death. "Mrs. Burke," said Elena Martinez, testing out Eliza's new name with a smile that lit up her weathered face. "It has a nice sound to it, doesn't it? Ben and I were just saying how right this feels, how much the judge would have loved to see this day." The title still felt strange to Eliza's ears, but she was beginning to understand that it came with more than just a change of name. It carried with it the responsibility of being the mistress of Willow Hall, the person who would help Jameson maintain the traditions and hospitality that had made the Burke home a center of community life for decades. It was just as these thoughts were settling in her mind that Harold Blackstone made his move. He approached the newlyweds during a quiet moment when they'd stepped aside to catch their breath, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere in their corner of the room. "Mr. Burke," Blackstone said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through legal maneuvering rather than honest persuasion. "Mrs. Burke," he added with a slight bow toward Eliza that managed to seem both courteous and somehow insulting. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion on such a happy occasion, but I have urgent business that simply cannot wait." Jameson felt his jaw tighten at the man's presumption. "Mr. Blackstone, this is hardly the time or place for business discussions. If you have matters to discuss regarding my father's estate, you can make an appointment through my attorney." "Ah, but that's precisely the issue," Blackstone said, producing a leather portfolio from inside his coat. "You see, there are some irregularities in your father's will that have come to light. Specifically, certain debts and obligations that were not fully disclosed during the initial reading, debts that, I'm afraid, may necessitate the sale of substantial portions of the ranch to satisfy." The words hit Jameson like a physical blow. He'd spent the past week going through his father's papers with the family attorney, and while the estate was complex, there had been no mention of significant debts that would threaten the ranch's integrity. "That's impossible," Jameson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "My father was meticulous about his financial affairs. Every debt, every obligation was documented and provided for." Blackstone's smile was thin and predatory. "Nevertheless, I have documentation here of substantial loans your father took against the property loans that are now in default and subject to immediate collection. Unless, of course, you're prepared to settle them immediately. The amount in question is quite substantial, more than most men could raise on short notice." Eliza watched her husband's face go pale as Blackstone produced official-looking documents with seals and signatures that appeared authentic. She didn't understand all the legal terminology, but she could see the devastating impact the words were having on Jameson. In the space of a few sentences, their wedding day was being transformed into a nightmare that threatened everything his family had built. "How much?" Jameson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. $200,000, Blackstone said with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. "Due immediately, or I'm afraid my clients will have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." The amount was staggering, more than the ranch could generate in cash, even in the best of years, more than any individual in the county could raise without selling everything they owned. Jameson felt the walls of his world closing in as he realized what this meant. The end of the Burke Ranch, the end of 4 generations of family legacy, the end of his ability to provide for the people who depended on him. There is, however, one alternative, Blackstone continued, his voice taking on the oily tone of someone offering a deal they knew was too good to be true. My clients are prepared to purchase the entire ranch for a fair market price, enough to settle all debts and leave you with a modest sum to start fresh somewhere else. You could be free of all obligations within the month. As the full impact of Blackstone's words settled over them, Eliza reached for Jameson's hand and found it trembling. This was their moment of truth, the test that would either destroy them or prove that their love was strong enough to weather any storm life might send their way. Eliza felt something cold and hard settle in her chest as she studied Harold Blackstone's smug expression. She had taught school long enough to recognize the particular brand of bullying that relied on intimidation and false authority, and she had learned from her late husband Daniel, a man who had dealt with his share of dishonest land speculators and fraudulent claim jumpers, to look for the telltale signs of deception. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority she used with unruly students, "may I examine those documents?" Blackstone looked startled by her intervention. "Mrs. Burke, I hardly think this is a matter for... My husband's business is my business," Eliza said firmly, extending her hand. "The documents, please." Reluctantly, Blackstone handed over the papers. Eliza studied them carefully, and as she read, her suspicion grew into certainty. "Jameson," she said quietly, "look at the date on this signature." Jameson leaned over her shoulder, following her finger to where his father's signature appeared beneath a date that made his blood run cold. "That's impossible," he said, his voice growing stronger. "My father was bedridden with pneumonia on this date. Dr. Williams was treating him, and Martha was with him around the clock. He couldn't have traveled to Denver to sign anything." "Perhaps he was feeling better than anyone realized," Blackstone suggested, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "No," said a new voice from behind them. "Doctor." Williams had approached quietly, drawn by the obvious tension in their corner of the room. "Judge Burke was unconscious for 3 days around that date. I have detailed medical records of his condition. There's no way he could have signed anything during that time." The color was beginning to drain from Blackstone's face as he realized his carefully laid plan was unraveling. "Doctor, surely you could be mistaken about the exact dates." "I'm never mistaken about my medical records, Doctor," Williams said with the authority of a man who had staked his professional reputation on precision. "And I find it very interesting that you would present documents bearing a signature from a time when my patient was physically incapable of holding a pen, let alone understanding what he was signing." Other guests had begun to notice the commotion, and a circle was forming around the confrontation. Ben Martinez appeared at Jameson's shoulder, his weathered face dark with anger. "Mr. Burke, you want me to escort this gentleman off the property?" But Eliza held up a hand. "Not yet, Ben. Mr. Blackstone, I believe you have some explaining to do. These documents are forgeries, aren't they? You're attempting to defraud my husband out of his rightful inheritance using fake papers and intimidation." Blackstone's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice had taken on a desperate edge. "Those documents will hold up in any court of law." "Will they?" asked another voice. Pastor Morrison had joined the group, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by something much sterner. "Because I happened to be visiting with Judge Burke on the date in question, praying with him during his illness. I can provide testimony about his condition, and I'm quite certain the church records will corroborate Dr. Williams' medical notes." The trap was closing around Blackstone, and he could see it. The documents that had seemed so convincing when presented to a grieving son in the chaos of a wedding reception were now being examined by multiple witnesses who could expose them for the frauds they were. "Furthermore," Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I suspect that if we were to investigate your clients' identities, we might find they don't exist at all. Or perhaps we'd discover they're associates of yours in whatever land speculation scheme this really represents." Jameson felt a surge of pride and love for his wife that almost overwhelmed him. Here she stood on their wedding day, fighting for their future with the same quiet strength and intelligence that had first drawn him to her. She was protecting not just him, but everything his family had built, with the fierce determination of someone who understood exactly what they were fighting for. "I think," Jameson said, his voice carrying the authority that came from 4 generations of Burke family leadership, "that you should leave our home immediately, Mr. Blackstone. And I think you should know that we'll be reporting this attempted fraud to the proper authorities. My father may be gone, but his friends and colleagues are very much alive, and they take a dim view of people who would prey on grieving families." Blackstone looked around the circle of faces, all of them hostile now, all of them united in defense of the newlyweds and the memory of the respected judge he had tried to dishonor. Without another word, he gathered his forged documents and retreated toward the door, his grand scheme collapsing around him like a house built on sand. As the door closed behind him, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. What had been tension and fear transformed into celebration and relief. The guests, who had witnessed their new mistress defend her family with such grace and determination, erupted into applause that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with genuine admiration. "Well," said Martha, appearing at Eliza's elbow with a glass of champagne, "I'd say you've just proven you're exactly the kind of woman this family needs. Judge Burke would be so proud." As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Jameson and Eliza found themselves alone in the parlor where it had all begun. The Christmas tree still glowed with warm light, the fire still crackled in the fireplace, but everything else had changed. They were husband and wife now, partners who had already proven they could face crisis together and emerge stronger. "How did you know?" Jameson asked, pulling his wife into his arms. "How did you see what I missed?" "Daniel taught me to recognize the signs," Eliza said, settling against his chest with a contentment that felt like coming home. "But more than that, I knew your father. I knew the kind of man he was, the careful way he handled his affairs. Those documents didn't match the character of the man who raised you." Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, gentle flakes that caught the light from the windows and created a sense of peace and privacy around their home. Christmas Day was just hours away, but for Jameson and Eliza Burke, the greatest gift had already been given. The knowledge that they had chosen well, that their love was strong enough to weather any storm, and that together they could honor the past while building a future worthy of the legacy they had inherited. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Burke," Jameson whispered against her hair. "Merry Christmas, my love," she replied, and in those simple words was contained all the promise of the life they would build, together a life rooted in love, strengthened by adversity, and blessed by the wisdom of those who had loved before them.